Welcome to the Coming Home Well podcast, the show that educates, supports, and advocates for the veteran community. Your host, Dr. Tyler Piron, U.S. Army retired, will bring you exciting conversations with amazing guests about resources, research, and military history, all geared to helping our warriors to come home well. Here's your host, Dr. Tyler Piron.
Welcome back to Coming Home Well. I'm your host, Tyler Piron, and today we are talking about something that's really important for veterans that have already been to the VA. They've got a claim, it's been adjudicated, they have a rating, and now the VA is asking, hey, we're going to propose to reduce your rating. That's a scary thing for a lot of veterans because what do you do? How do you do it? And how do you not screw up by not following whatever guidance that needs to be done, or saying or doing something, or not doing something? And that causes a lot of problems for a lot of veterans. So we have Bill Libby. He's with the Department of Veterans Services here in the Commonwealth, and he trains the other lawyers with the appeals. So he does this all the time. So we have a great resource to talk about proposed reductions. Bill, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well.
Thanks. It's good to be back, Tyler.
I'm so glad to have you guys as a resource. Department of Veterans Services does so much for every veteran in the Commonwealth, even if they don't know about it, but you should. And so I'm really glad that you're here.
Glad to be here.
So let's talk about proposed reductions. Like, that's a scary thing. Like, you're like, hey, I've got a rating, I'm pretty stable. And all of a sudden, seemingly out of the blue, it's usually not out of the blue, but there's a reason they're proposing. What is a proposed reduction? Let's start from there.
Sure. So a proposed reduction is a type of action that VA can take that's sort of in a broader class called predeterminations. And to understand a predetermination, I think it's good to think about a basic constitutional principle, something that we call due process. This idea that government can take life, liberty, and property away from someone. Due process is just about how they must do so, which rules they have to follow, basically making sure that they respect the individual's right along the way. When someone has a VA benefit, that is a property right. So VA can't just take that level of compensation away from you. There are certain things that they must do before doing so. And so I think the thing that really frightens most veterans is when they get that initial proposal, that action that's saying, hey, we are proposing to take this benefit away. And I think it's very easy to panic, like you said, when you get that letter, because it is a very, very scary thing. But it's important to read that letter to think about how you respond to that, because the VA will tell you what to do. Proposed reductions are just one type of predetermination. Other things are like, for example, the proposals to create overpayments and debts. Or sometimes VA, instead of just reducing a rating, may try to sever it outright. Or, removing a dependent from an award. There's many, many things that can constitute a predetermination action from VA, but I would say proposed reductions are definitely the most common one.
So what initiates a proposed reduction? Is it just sort of random? I mean, I don't think it'd be random, because that would be creating extra work for themselves for no reason.
Yeah, it's not random. So to think about a proposed reduction, it's important to remember how most ratings are assigned in the first place, right? So every VA disability rating is based on the current severity of somebody's symptoms. So sort of implicit in any kind of proposed reduction is this belief by VA that your condition has improved in some way. And most often what they are doing, 9 times out of 10, is VA is comparing the C&P report, the medical examination that you had when your claim was granted and rated, to one that was done more recently. And I think one of the things veterans don't know about the C&P exam process is when VA pays for a contract medical exam, the service that they are paying for is the completion of a government standard form called a Disability Benefits Questionnaire, or a DBQ for short. And a DBQ, basically think of it almost like a checklist, right? It's sort of where medicine meets bureaucracy, right? So you have
like that's never a good meeting.
No, it's never a good meeting. That's correct. Yeah. So you'll have a DBQ for like every kind of bodily system that someone can have. So there's one for the heart, there's one for the knees, for the hips, for the back, and for mental health, and for diabetes, and for all of these different kinds of disabilities that someone can have. But every DBQ is basically like a checklist. Which diagnosis does someone have? what are their symptoms? And of course, the symptoms they're looking at are the same symptoms that VA uses to assign ratings in the 38 CFR, right? So, for example, with musculoskeletal disabilities, they're measuring your range of motion. How well can you flex and extend and rotate and move around? And so when VA proposes a reduction, what they are usually doing is they're taking this DBQ, they are comparing the most recent one to the one that came before, the one that authorized the original rating, and they are kind of looking for differences in these standard forms. So a really good example of that is mental health. Mental health is assigned based on someone's level of occupational and social impairment. So, let's say someone gets a VA examination a couple of years ago that says they have occupational and social impairment in most areas, and then they have one later on that says they only have mild occupational and social impairment. VA, even though contract examiners very rarely use the specific words that someone has improved, when those reports hit the VA rater's desk and they make that comparison, they infer improvement and they will propose a reduction, usually just based on differences between the earlier form and the later one. And therein lies a lot of the errors that VA makes with these, by the way, and a lot of what we see on the appeals arena. Um, I think that one of the things that I've seen veterans do a lot that really sets them up for failure is when VA sends that proposal letter, because again, remember, this is something they have to do. It's due process, right? They can't just outright reduce the rating if it's going to lower your level of compensation. They have to kind of tell you what they're planning to do first.
Mhm.
They send you a letter. There's a pretty strict response time. The maximum response time is 60 days to these proposals, but really it's ideal to respond within 30 days. I think veterans have a fear reaction to that sometimes. They don't read the letter and they just immediately maybe try to file the same kind of claim that you would if you were challenging a final decision. So, for example, a supplemental claim, a higher level review, or appealing something off to the Board of Veterans Appeals. But critically, you can't do that to a proposed reduction because
Mm.
VA hasn't actually done anything yet. They're just telling you what they intend to do, what they propose to do. And so if you read the letter, it's very, very important to read the letter because you will see they use terms like we propose to do this instead of we did this, right? It's the difference between something they wish to do versus something they have actually done. And there's really only one way to respond to the proposal: within 30 days, request a hearing. You can do that even just on a piece of paper. You can do that on any kind of letter. And then, if you can, submit evidence, usually medical evidence, that shows your disability didn't improve if you have access to that kind of thing. Most often, the best kind of medical evidence to submit is your own DBQ, if you can get one, right? Because that's how these almost always happen, is because VA is looking at this standard form. Those standard forms are available online. If you have a doctor who is willing to fill that out and they can list the same criteria that evaluated your rating originally, or maybe even worse criteria, again, VA can respond to that well, but you really need to request the hearing and really work with a VSO, because that makes it harder for VA to just ignore anything that you might have submitted, when you're trying to challenge the proposal before it becomes final. If you don't respond to it, they are likely to just take the proposed action and go ahead and reduce the rating.
Pretty much always, right? Like you're like, oh yeah, I'm not going to fight it. I don't disagree. Essentially, it's the way that
Mhm.
they look at it.
Correct. And I say this from the perspective of, the appeals attorney. I get involved a lot when the proposals are wrong. I will say, just in the interest of full disclosure, sometimes the proposal is right. If there's a disability that's really gotten better, VA is going to reduce that rating. And the most common example of that is cancer. Most cancers, when you have an active cancer, you are going to get 100% because you have an active malignancy. But let's say that your cancer goes into remission. That's great. But from VA's perspective, they don't see you as having that active malignancy anymore because you don't. So what they're going to do is they're going to reduce that rating. They're going to take the 100% away, but they will replace that rating with like your cancer residuals. So for example, with prostate cancer, it's extremely common for someone who has prostate cancer. They'll get that 100% rating for as long as they have the cancer, but then it goes into remission. Maybe the prostate is removed, or what have you. It's
Some
responsive to
treatment, you're
chemotherapy,
doing
some
well.
therapy, right? But then what they will do is they'll take the 100% away and they'll rate you based on the residuals that you have, which for prostate cancer is usually things like urinary incontinence. That's usually the most common one. It's some kind of avoiding dysfunction of sorts. And, in those cases, the only time when we would recommend really challenging the proposal would be if VA somehow missed certain residuals that should have factored into your rating but didn't. And that kind of goes back to those proposal letters that I mentioned before, because when VA proposes a reduction, they have to be pretty specific about it, or at least they're supposed to be. They're supposed to tell you, hey, this is what your rating was, this is what we think it should be, and this is why we think that you have improved. I said earlier on that almost all of these proposals come from C&P examinations. Usually the language that they use for that is that we've reviewed some recent medical records that suggest improvement, that kind of thing. They don't always specifically say that it was the C&P exam, but 9 times out of 10, because it
So
does
it
come in
really
that nice
shouldn't be
form.
too much of a surprise if someone has a recent C&P exam that there may be a reduction. Now, usually you only have a C&P if you're either they ask for one, they reach out and say, hey, we'd like you to do another exam, or if you're doing another claim, right?
Correct. And actually, that gets into one of the really big other mistakes that I see veterans make. So when VA reduces a rating, it is their burden of proof to show that the rating should be reduced. Because again, it goes back to that fundamental principle of fairness, that due process, right? They can't take life, liberty, and property away from someone unless they followed the rules. Well, VA's burden for reducing a rating changes depending on how long that rating has been in effect. And the magic number is 5 years. 5 years is where 38 CFR 3.344 begins to kick in. And as a matter of regulation, a disability that has been in effect at the same rate for 5 years or more is considered stable. And once something is considered stable, VA needs to see something called sustained improvement to be able to reduce. And in layman's terms, that basically means they can't propose a reduction, or at least they're not supposed to. If they do, it's a pretty easy thing to challenge. They can't reduce just based on a single C&P exam. There are some other rules that kind of factor in depending on like which disabilities you're talking about. For example, when it comes to mental health, I found a lot of success with 38 CFR, I believe it's 4.126A. And that regulation basically says that VA can't assign mental health ratings only using the finding of one exam. So like I said earlier, it's very, very common that veterans will, just be seen for one exam, be rated at a certain level, and then get another exam later on, usually because they file for an increase. The C&P exam implies some kind of improvement, but in the case of mental health, I like to cite to 4.126 because they can't assign the rating just based on the one exam. So I use that to say that you can't reduce the rating based
And
on
that's
one
usually
exam
because
either.
like mental health conditions can be more variable than say missing a limb or
Yeah.
musculoskeletal issues or something like that.
Yes, and I think that's probably the intent of the regulation. And again, I think it just goes to the idea that someone can be having a good day on the day of their exam, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every day is a good day for them. And I think that especially really shallow C&P exams, I've definitely seen that before, where the C&P examiner asks the veteran, "Hey, how are you doing today?" And they say, "I'm doing great." They're
Yeah,
just
like
trying to be
I'm
friendly.
fine.
Yeah,
They're
exactly,
being
and they just sort of
social.
take
They're
that.
not really
Right.
addressing the question of how they're doing.
Exactly. And of course, these C&P examinations, that's one of the big flaws with, I think, many of the proposals that we see. These are not doctors who are treating the veteran. These
Right.
are people who probably meet with you for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. All VA really has, they were not there during the appointment, right? So all they have is the final report that the examiner chooses to provide to them. They don't necessarily know what went into that. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, why it's really important to have a good advocate as you're navigating these proposals, because a good advocate is going to be able to scrutinize those medical findings. I think one of the biggest problems that I see with proposed reductions is that VA gives sometimes what I can only describe as just zealous deference to the findings of really bad C&P exams. Like for example, you'll see a C&P exam that begins by saying that, like let's say it's for the knees and the veteran walks with a cane and they use a brace, but then the examiner writes down that they don't have any problems, there's no pain, or anything like that, where they're making these very self-evident, very contradictory findings. But I think because VA raters are not doctors, sometimes some raters are very uncomfortable second guessing things that they say because they feel like they are not allowed to, even though weighing that evidence and being critical of things in an exam report that just don't make sense, that don't add up. That's a big part of it. And kind of circling back to something I said earlier, that 5-year rule is really, really important. And I think one of the biggest mistakes I see veterans make is they file for an increase right before they were about to hit that 5-year mark. If you can wait, just wait. File the intent to file instead of filing the claim. If you're 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, whatever, I think it's worth it.
If you're anywhere close to 5 years
Yes.
at the same rating, just wait.
Just stay there. Just stay there. File the intent to file if you're really concerned about, preserving your effective date. But if you can afford to wait to let that kick in, you are making things so much easier for yourself in the long term, because again, it makes it so much harder for VA to come along and try and reduce those ratings using a single C&P exam. Because I will tell you, sometimes what VA will do, even if you can kind of get the rater to see, hey, this medical report that this provider submitted is not adequate. There's a big problem with this. There's a huge disconnect between what the veteran is saying with what they wrote down on their report. Sometimes, even if you can convince them of that, their remedy is, okay, well, let's just get another exam. And if the big problem in the first place and why the veteran is in that situation is because the examiners aren't doing their jobs correctly, you're kind of taking a big leap of faith that the next person is going to do things right. So honestly, the best way to deal with the proposed reduction, like the ideal way, is to just not put yourself in that situation in the first place if you don't have to. Again, there's a lot that you can do.
That action that would have the VA look at it at all for any reason.
If you can avoid it, and again, if you must, think about how you're supporting that application, right? Because if you don't submit anything with your claim for increase, you have to understand the thing VA is going to make that decision based on is that contract exam that they're going to order you to. And if there's nothing contrary that they're looking at, that's probably going to carry the day in their mind.
So let's talk about, there's some other time limits as well. That 5, 10, and 20, I think are the magic numbers, so to speak.
The other one that comes into play really is more of the 20-year mark, and that's the point. If a rating has been in effect at the same rate for 20 years or more, it becomes extremely protected to the point that it actually can't be reduced unless there was fraud. And of course, I have personally never ever seen that. But 5 years, I think the protections that offers are pretty robust. And 20 years, again, it's very rare to see VA, ever go after that kind of rating. But when they do, it's usually pretty easy to deal with. Another sort of protection, kind of going into the same vein of your question, is total disability ratings. Like when you have like a single disability that's evaluated at 100%, it's 38 CFR 3.343. VA has to show what's called material improvement. It's sort of a really high standard. You kind of have to show that, again, there's been this really significant level of improvement that's going to last under ordinary life conditions. But, I also want to say that I think that in these reduction conversations at the regional office level, this often gets lost, but VA does have a basic burden of proof that they have to meet, even if the rating hasn't been in effect for 5 years or more. And this actually comes from a court case from the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims called Faust v. West. And the idea is that any reduction, it has to be based on really three things. It has to be based on a complete review of the veteran's medical history. It has to be based on adequate exams. And it also has to reflect what the CAVC called an actual change in the veteran's ability to function under ordinary life conditions. I think that the regional office, sometimes the errors that I've seen them make, they just sort of assume that if it's under 5 years, that it's sort of fair game for kind of any, implication on the exam. But that's really not true.
5 years, they can look at it, they can change it.
And their ability and willingness to consider these arguments kind of varies a lot depending on the rater, to be honest with you. But I like to really argue around that actual change standard because, I have a big question as to whether a box that is checked on a standard form or unchecked on a government standard form, does that really represent a change in someone's ability to function under ordinary life conditions? Right. I think there are times when it can, but I think there are many times, especially when it's not accompanied by any particular explanation from the examiner, where it shouldn't count as that. And again, that kind of goes back to one of the things I said earlier, where very, very rarely does an examiner specifically state this veteran's condition is getting better. It is a non-medical professional, somebody else. It's the VA rater who's reading that, and they are inferring improvement.
Mm-hmm. They didn't have as many symptoms as last time, or the examiner didn't note as many symptoms,
yes.
Even though they may not have asked, and the first guy did, and the second person did not. Therefore, it's an improvement, but really, it's just a lack of thoroughness.
Yes, and there are also certain types of disabilities where the examiner isn't even the final arbiter of what the veteran's symptoms are. I think a really good example of that is migraine disorders. Once someone has a migraine disorder, the frequency and severity of their symptoms are a factual determination. How often you have migraine. So I've absolutely seen VA try to make really steep migraine reductions because maybe someone is at 50% for having frequent migraines that are productive of economic inadaptability. But then what ends up happening is their examiner just checks the box saying that they have it once a month or something like that. But you can see right there the veteran is telling them what's happening, right? Well, you are not beholden to the box that the examiner checked on their report when it isn't even a medical determination, right? Veterans are generally credible in this system to talk about things that they directly did and felt and observed. And, that's going to end the moment that you make a medical judgment. But when you say, I have migraines this often, and this is how it affects me when I have them, as long as you actually have that diagnosis, that's actually in VA's internal manual, the M21, that, that's valid evidence of your symptomatology. And we definitely fight proposed reductions. We win proposed reductions when, we have conditions like that, because there are certain areas where, again, the things that the examiner writes down aren't even the final arbiter of the matter anyway.
So in this instance, they said, they within the 30 days, but out to 60 is the max, but preferably 30 days. They write back to the VA and says, yes, I would like to have a hearing. Mm-hmm. And they've been diagnosed with migraines previously and current. It's a current diagnosis. And the only thing that's really at issue is how often. Mm-hmm. and how significant they are. And that is, the veteran can tell and provide evidence to that effect. Mm-hmm. In this particular case, we're talking about migraines, and that's an important evidence, even though, because you're not at home, you're not at these other places necessarily. There's the doctor's just filling out a form at the DBQ, mm-hmm. and they check 1, 2, or whatever they had wrote down, but that's really not the evidence. The evidence is the veteran telling them, like, hey, this is what happens, and they can provide that evidence because it's still valid, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in those particular cases, one of the things that I think is so valuable about working with a representative and requesting the hearing is, like I said earlier, it makes it harder for VA to just sidestep anything that you might submit within the response time for the proposal letter. But what it also does is eventually that case is going to be assigned to a specific VA rater. Mm-hmm. And as advocates, we have access to VA systems. And one of the things that we do is we dialogue with VA raters before the hearings. And when I see a proposed reduction that just shouldn't have been proposed, I will reach out to them. I'll figure out who it is. And sometimes we just avoid those hearings altogether, just with a friendly conversation with the rater, because the rater who's assigned to the hearing is certainly not the same person. It never is the same one who actually proposed the reduction in the first place. So sometimes when you reach out to them, you can just sort of say, hey, look, I've written like these 3 paragraphs about why this is wrong, and here's the citations for why you can just keep this rating the way that it was. And very often we're able to avoid those hearings altogether. But if you don't request the hearing and you don't have the representative, you don't get that opportunity to have that dialogue. Of course, you can still have the dialogue with the rater on the day of the hearing, but I find that even when we can't avoid the proposal outright prior to it, mm-hmm. it usually leads to a more productive conversation than you'd get otherwise, because you're sort of putting the bug in their ear, right? Like you're letting them know, hey, this is what we're looking at, right? This is kind of what we're going to talk about. It prompts them to do their own review. And again, I just find that we have some pretty productive conversations with VA raters because we have a good relationship with the regional offices that hold these hearings.
And that makes a lot of sense. They're not wedded to it. It's not like, you're attacking them. They're defending perhaps a decision someone else made, and they're open to more evidence. Yeah. They're like, hey, maybe you're right. Okay. And it's not like, oh, you're wrong. It's, mm-hmm. I think there was a mistake made. Let's fix the mistake.
Right. And I that's one of my favorite things about this area of law, Tyler, is that a friendly email can make such a big difference, because I really do think that everyone who is a part of this system in any way, shape, or form, they want to do right by veterans. I really
Mhm.
do believe that. I think the system itself is sometimes set up in a way where good people aren't allowed to make the right decision, or they feel like they don't have the latitude to do so.
That's
But
fair.
again, just kind of having that good relationship with the VA can make such a big difference. Again, I say that. At the same time, I definitely have had some very frustrating conversations if someone on the other end is not very well trained. I have seen some proposed reductions in the past where, for the veteran's condition to have improved in the manner that VA is stating it, it would actually be like a medical miracle. And it's impossible. And you're kind of trying to show them, hey, this is very much, still the case as it was when the veteran was rated. The example that's coming to mind, I obviously can't get into case specifics, but in VA rating schedules, there is a term called ankylosis. It has been in the rating schedule since it was first written in 1919. And it basically just means limited motion due to fusion. So, for example, someone who has had like a joint fusion surgery technically has a form of artificial ankylosis, right? Unfortunately, because VA ends up looking for that term, which doctors really don't use anymore, right? Like if someone has a fusion surgery, doctors aren't going to write that down saying veteran has an ankylosed joint. They're just going to say the veteran is status post-fusion.
Yeah.
But if the box for ankylosis isn't checked on the form, VA will act as though, I not all the time, but I've seen it before, well, they will act as though somehow the veteran's fused joint is no longer fused, maybe even if it was permanently fused by a surgical procedure, right? And I've absolutely seen that before, where it's like veteran is status post-fusion, and then no is checked under the box for ankylosis, and VA will kind of come along and try and take away, very well-established ratings as if something has changed, and you're just kind of getting them to talk about the plain definition of what this word means. That's a very difficult thing, and I
It'd
think
be
that's
as
one of
silly
the
as saying, "Hey, his foot grew back." Yeah.
kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
That, that
I
that's
mean,
that's basically the level
just
of what I've
confused.
seen sometimes, not all the time, but I've definitely seen that kind of thing before. And I think, honestly, I feel that sometimes these proposed reductions reveal. Again, just sort of my perspective, this is not the opinion of the state, this is just Bill's opinion, but they reveal really very real flaws in the way VA evaluates disabilities. Because sometimes VA is looking for criteria that just aren't spelled out in the average medical record, right? Range
Mhm.
of motion, I think, is the biggest example of that. Most musculoskeletal conditions are evaluated based on measuring someone's range of motion. So for example, for the knee, how well can you flex? How well can you extend? And they measure these things using a tool called a goniometer, which is basically like a protractor, but for
Mhm.
measuring joint movements. Um, but the thing about range of motion is that it's kind of inherently this very controlled clinical measurement. It's only ever taken when someone is sitting on their exam table, and they're right there in this very controlled environment. It's not mimicking, again, going back to what I said earlier about how all reductions have to show an actual change under ordinary life conditions. Range of motion is never taken under ordinary life conditions.
No,
It's
it's
just not. And at least as a taxpayer, like I don't really care what someone's range of motion is on the day of their CNP exam. I care whether they can sit and squat and go up and down stairs. I care whether they can, sit and stand without pain.
right.
And those are the kinds of things that veterans respond to these proposals with, sort of thinking, okay, well, certainly VA is going to see it, but because the rating schedule is set up in a way where it's looking for this measurement that, unless you have like a chiropractor maybe, or like someone who just happens to be taking that range of motion score just because that's the way they're treating you,
Mhm.
it's almost like it's not relevant to them sometimes. You can't
Yeah.
get
You
range of
only really
motion from
see
an
it in
MRI.
physical therapy. You
Correct.
don't
Yeah.
you don't see it like at my I've had 4 shoulder surgeries, ankyliosis and fusion. I'm fully aware of all these things for a number of reasons. And the only time that range of motion is ever even discussed is at physical therapy. Like
Hmm.
my ortho doctor is not going, well, let's check your range of motion. He doesn't care.
Yeah.
It's about physical therapy and hey, let's get some more range of motion. Can we do this? And we're trying to, those are the metrics for better physical therapy, but it's certainly not daily or even routinely even checked. So yeah, I totally understand that point. So we've talked about how these things happen. So
Hmm.
why proposals for reductions are initiated. I do have a question, something I hear a lot of. Hey, I have a condition, pick any condition, and it's not like permanent, like bone fusion or something like that. And I got rated 3, 4, let's call it 5 years ago, just to keep it with the 5-year rule. And I haven't been to the doctor. I'm sort of just dealing with it. I haven't, been going to the VA. I haven't been going to private care. Just take some Tylenol and I deal with it. Is that something the VA will then say, hey, we haven't seen any medical records. We haven't seen you've gotten any care for this. We don't think it exists anymore. Or does there have to be some other action? Do they have to request something? Do they have to do something? How does that happen?
Well, if we're talking about a situation where something has been in effect for 5 years or more, they're not going to be able to reduce it even based on just one CNP exam. But what I can tell you is that in general, for better or worse, I think VA does tend to make negative inferences based on a lack of medical records. They're not supposed to do that, right? Like, they can't discount credible veteran statements about the onset or continuity of their symptoms just because it isn't documented in some concurrent medical treatment record. They do. Sometimes we have to appeal that kind of stuff. But I guess what you're kind of getting at, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're asking me, is VA going to come along and try to sever a disability outright just because someone doesn't have recent treatment?
Or sever it, or reduce it significantly. Like, hey, it really can't bother you that much if you haven't been getting medical care for it.
Yeah, so first of all, severance is a totally different beast, really, because for VA to sever a disability rating outright, and remember, even a 0% rating is technically still service connection. For VA to sever a rating outright, it has to have been clearly and unmistakably erroneous to have granted it in the first place. So I find it pretty unlikely that in the scenario you described, someone would end up being severed, because again, that's a very, very high bar. That clear and unmistakable error is the highest evidentiary burden that exists in the VA system, and it's rare for them to properly meet it, truthfully. But if you're talking about the reduction, the proposed reduction, again, 5
But
years.
the veteran is 0% is this, is pretty much the same as severing, even though legally I know it's not.
I mean, you still get healthcare for it,
right.
even at 0%. But let's say that, and it'll be easier to use, let's say, the 4-year mark, because again, at the 5-year mark, things become protected. I think that you would have less of a danger of doing that. But let's say that someone
4 years or 3 years.
Let's say like that someone has it's been in effect for 4 years. You go in, you haven't had any current treatment. That's one of those areas where I see veterans set themselves up to fail, because what you are doing, remember, VA places a lot of emphasis on the findings of those contract medical exams. So if you're filing for an increase on something that you don't have current treatment for, you better be sure that you really trust that CNP examiner to do their job correctly and to evaluate your condition correctly. Which is not a safe assumption, personally, in my opinion, because you are basically putting the outcome of that claim that is going to rest squarely on what that examiner says and how they fill that DBQ report out.
And that's a big risk.
Huge risk. It's a huge risk.
That's the only thing you're submitting.
Yes, and that's why, generally speaking, I recommend that veterans wait. If they are anywhere close to that 5-year mark, just wait. Please, just wait. Your VSO will thank you for waiting. But I think that one of the other things that veterans do, kind of talking about risk, that we haven't talked about before, I think that people file for total disability based on individual unemployability very, very often without realizing what that actually represents and what VA is going to do with that application. TDIU, for the uninitiated, is basically sort of like an exception to the usual rating criteria. It is VA's policy that any veteran who cannot pursue and keep gainful employment due to service-connected disabilities, it is their policy that that person is going to be given a total disability rating, with, of course, total kind of being equivalent to 100%. And what that means is that a veteran who does not have that 100% rating on scheduler grounds, like, again, based on the criteria of their disability compared to the specific things VA is looking for, they will treat that person as if they are 100% for compensation purposes, even though, whatever their actual percentage rating isn't going to change. So, for example, someone
rating might be 70%, but they can't work, or even 90%, something less than 100. Doesn't matter what, for the purposes of this conversation. But hey, I can't work, so we're going to treat you like you're 100% and get all the benefits of 100%, all the money, etc. but you're not at 100%, but we're going to treat you that way and pay you that way as if you were.
Yeah, there's a little bit more that goes into TDIU in terms of like the minimum rating that VA would prefer for you to have before you get that. But even that can be waived in certain circumstances. But the thing to understand about TDIU is because it is that exception, you're seeking that exception based on the severity of your condition, VA will treat that as a claim for increase on every single disability that you are service connected for. So one of the other biggest mistakes that I see veterans make here is, they get that 70% rating for the first time and they think, great, I also can't work. Now I'm going to file for TDIU. And they don't realize that when they do that, it's the same thing as if they had just filed for an increase on that unprotected disability. It's going to trigger a whole new round of C&P exams for everything that they're service connected for. And if any of those exams contain different findings from what the ratings were based on, VA is likely to propose a reduction. And in fact, if there was one like really big pitfall that I see veterans make more often than anything else, it's that they don't appreciate the implications of filing for TDIU many times because, VA doesn't really explain this on the front end, right? The form just talks about your work history, your educational history, your occupational history. They're not going to tell you that you're going to get re-examined for everything. And I think fewer people would file for that in unsafe situations if they knew that.
Sort of the mechanics. They're not explaining the mechanics of it. They're like, hey, I can't work. Why can't you work? What kind of education? What kind of work did you do? Things like that. And then all of a sudden, everything is fair game.
Yes.
And they're going to look and say, are you really disabled enough that you can't work even if you're not 100%?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is. And it's not even so much about whether you can work or not at that point. Remember, because each disability is assigned based on the criteria in the CFR. So let's say, again, just a knee disability, right? And you file for TDIU, you get this knee exam and your range of motion this time is different than it was 2 years ago. That's not even about whether you can work so much at that point. VA is just going to try and take that rating away. They're going to interpret that improvement. Again, even though, like I said earlier, I personally have some issues with range of motion and whether that's actually that exemplary of what someone's disability is and how it really affects them. But, sometimes it'll be like, they just won't even get to that question of IU if they feel like your condition has improved.
Gotcha. So you put every rating at risk if you file for IU.
Yes.
And so that's if you really truly need it, help it, but just go into it with your eyes open, that there's a good chance that if one of those exams says you're better, they're going to propose to reduce that particular disability.
Right. And be careful about that. And again, if you can support that kind of application, I'm not saying to never file for TDIU if your ratings haven't been in effect for 5 years, but just recognize that you are exposing yourself to a very real risk. Again, once the 5-year mark has passed, like as a VSO, I have a lot less anxiety about that, right? Because once you start looking at something that's been at the same rate for 5 years or more, there are a ton of really open-ended arguments that we can make as to why VA shouldn't reduce based on the findings of an exam. But if you must file before you hit that point, just be aware of what you're setting yourself up to do and make sure, going to your point earlier, you are supporting that with medical records, with statements from your doctor about why you cannot work, right? Because otherwise you're just sort of leaving VA to figure it out. And for reasons I've said before, they are ultimately just going to go by what their examiner says, who is someone who doesn't know you, has treated you probably for, again, not treated you at all. They're not there to treat you. They've just met with you for 20 minutes. Right. Maybe they didn't do all of the right testing. I think that's very, very common. Like I said earlier with musculoskeletal ratings, they're supposed to use that tool, the goniometer, to measure your range of motion. Not all examiners do that. I know of a few in the state of Virginia. I'm not going to name them, but just sort of working a lot of appeals, I see reports from the same examiners, and there are examiners that just don't do that.
Are they swagging it? Or are they sort of just rough estimates? Or
sometimes, yeah, they'll just eyeball it. And I think the really insidious thing, to be honest with you, is sometimes they will say they used it even though they didn't.
Yeah,
I've definitely seen that kind of thing before.
That takes extra time. Hey, lift your arm up, move your leg, boom.
Yeah. Oh, you're fine. Yeah,
30%, 20%, whatever the range of motion might be, or whatever it is. Okay, so proposed reductions are scary, and so the key takeaways I'm hearing so far is: first, don't ignore it. Don't just throw it and go, well, if I ignore it, it'll go away. That doesn't work with the IRS. It doesn't work with the VA. Second, respond. Now, if you have a VSO, like my VSO is Department of Veteran Services, what do? Do I reach out to the Department of Veteran Services and say, hey, I got this letter from the VA. You probably got a copy of it. What do I do?
Well, yeah, and we don't, saying that we get a copy of it, it's certainly, mailed to us. But at the same time, like when I represent a veteran, I'm not their representative the same way I would be if I was their private attorney, right? So
Sure.
notifying the state isn't the same thing as notifying your local VSO, but I can always be prompted to check on it. I have electronic access to a veteran's VA record just by virtue of my accreditation. So any veteran represented by Virginia is someone whose file I can see. Yes, that's exactly what you would do. You would reach out to your VSO. You would say, hey, I got this letter. It's got the state on it. I know I need to respond to this. Please tell me what to do. And in all likelihood, what your VSO is going to do is they're going to submit a form called a 21-4138. It's basically just sort of a blank slate form, statement in support of claim. You can put just about anything on it, and they will use that to request a hearing. But again, you can actually do it in other ways too. Sometimes veterans will come to us on like the 29th day, and then they can maybe just call VA and do it at the 1-800 number if we just know that we need to get that in immediately. We prefer to do it in writing if we can, but if it's really under the gun, you can request that in other ways too. And by the way, I also want to point out something too. Technically the response window for these proposals is actually 60 days, not 30. It's just that if you respond to it after 30 days, but before 60 days, VA might go ahead and reduce the rating anyway while they wait for your hearing. So to get the most protection possible, you really need to respond to it within 30 days. But if you're past that 30-day mark for some reason, don't feel like all is lost. You'll still get a hearing as long as you answer it within 60. You just need to understand that they may go ahead and implement their proposed action while
that's
you
a
wait.
really important point. So if it's after 30, but before 60, you really have 60 days to request the hearing, but they'll say, oh, well, we're going to do the action, but you get a hearing. And then if they rule in your favor, it goes back to the way it was. It's retroactive as if it never happened or what have you. But in the interim, you're still reduced.
Right. Whereas if you do it within 30 days, the clock is stopped basically until you have your hearing. And by the way, even if VA does eventually implement the reduction, those reductions usually become become effective rather. I believe it's 2 months after the date of the rating decision, right? So what you do by requesting that hearing is you're buying yourself a lot of time to keep your existing evaluation for longer than you would if you just didn't respond at all.
Right. So that's at least 3 months. I mean, 30 plus 2 months after the hearing. So do people, and I'm sure this happens, which is crazy, they request the hearing and then blow it off. What happens then? They
You mean
say,
like
yep,
they don't attend their hearing, or
hey, I think you guys are wrong, etc. And then how do the hearings go? Do they have to be in person? Is it all remote? How does that work? What are the mechanics? Because people will probably stress about that. And
yeah.
I can't drive to Richmond or Roanoke or wherever it might be.
Sure. So the good news about hearings, actually, both at the VA regional office and even the Board of Veterans Appeals these days, is there's a virtual option for everything. Almost all of the proposed reduction hearings that we do these days are done over the phone. If you really want the video component, you can do it over video, like VA uses Microsoft Teams. But when I have the hearings, almost all of them are just done over like a standard conference call. So you definitely do not have to go to Roanoke. And in fact, most people, as it turns out, don't like driving to Roanoke because it takes a very long time to get there. For example,
no matter
for me,
where
it's
you are
4
in
hours.
Virginia, it takes a long time.
Yeah, exactly. No, it would be 4 hours for me, and thankfully, I'm able to help people from my home near Gloucester. If even though the hearing might be sort of administered through the Roanoke regional office, but yeah, there's definitely no in-person requirement. You can if you're adamant about it, but just so you know. Especially if you're thinking about driving a long distance, I can kind of understand it if you might already live in the area. But at the end of the day, VA doesn't really care about you showing up. I say it kind of flippantly. It's about what's in your record. It's about the reasons the proposal was proposed in the first place and reasons why it might be wrong. And in most cases, I think an in-person appearance doesn't really add to that or change that. I think we have some people who are very adamant. I want to go and I want to look this person in the eye and see if they're going to reduce me then. But that's they'll look you in the eye and they'll reduce you unless you, give them a good reason why they shouldn't. And that's going to have to be something that's in your record at the end of the day.
So let's talk about coverage and not coverage, VSOs and the role that they play, because some people love to do everything themselves. I'm going to fight the system. I'm going to beat the man. There's a lot of great VSOs out there. The Department of Veteran Services is one, but there's a lot of them out there that are, accredited. They're legit. I would imagine you would say, yes, you need a VSO, but obviously some people aren't. What's your thoughts? What's your views on using a VSO to deal with proposed reductions?
I think it's required. I do. And kind of going back to one of the things that I said earlier, one of the biggest mistakes I see unrepresented veterans make is they respond to these proposals the wrong way. They respond to them as if they are final decisions.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a final decision from VA, you can file a supplemental claim with new and relevant evidence. You can seek a higher level review. You can file a board appeal. You have a few options for that.
And these are for increases or new claims, right?
Well,
In
if you have
general.
something that's denied outright, right? Like if you
Right.
have a denial that you're trying to deal with, of any kind of benefit, you can respond to it in those ways. I see veterans who they read the proposal, I think they get mad about it. And they're not reading what the letter actually tells them to do, and they try to deal with it as if it's something that VA has already done instead of something that they only propose to do. There is one way to respond to a proposed reduction, and only one way. You request the hearing in writing to the regional office, and you submit evidence, probably medical evidence, showing that your disability didn't improve. If you do anything else, VA will not acknowledge it. They'll probably just send you a development letter explaining what you did wrong. But remember, because these things have such a strict response time, that's probably going to go past that 30-day window that you had to respond to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, when I just feel that working with an accredited VSO is so important for that reason, because again, there is only one way to deal with this, and a VSO is going to be in a better position to do that. This is also a good time, honestly, to sort of caution people against the dangers of using unaccredited representatives, right? I think we have a lot of folks out there who kind of rely on people who hold themselves out as like claims consultants, like, oh, we'll prepare the forms for you, we'll put this application together for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're not accredited by VA. They don't know what they're doing. And when you end up filing, let's say this group wants you to file for TDIU because they get more money from you if that's granted. Well, if you end up facing a proposed reduction, they're going to be hands off. They can't represent you at your hearing. So that's sort of a cautionary tale. Please don't work with unaccredited claims consultants. I think there's a huge unethical component of what they're doing. They promise veterans that they're going to get these total disability ratings before they've even reviewed the file. They outsource you to some doctor in Florida who's never met with you and who's pretty much written their opinion before they've even talked to you. It's hugely unethical. I think that some people gamble and win with that, but it is a gamble. And if you ever need support, beyond that, they're not going to be there for you the way that an accredited representative is going to be.
Yeah, it sounds more like a mill of some sort, and I've seen some of these in the veteran spaces. Hey, this guy will, they'll write you the medical evaluation that you want and things like that. And people pass along names and organizations. And that's been my experience. I've seen it. It's very icky because if it's legit, any doctor, the doctor that you're seeing, for instance, or the Q examiner, not necessarily every time, they're churning numbers too. They make mistakes, but there's a component to that. Get a legitimate VSO, folks. Don't just go it alone, especially for proposed reductions. It can be a big deal. If you're at 50, 60, 80, 100%, a proposed reduction is going to be a significant amount of money in the future. Make sure all these VSOs are free. Okay. That's the key. You're not paying somebody, but they're the ones who can actually help you and not just like, oh, yeah, whatevs, and you're out there hanging. So there's a lot of things to worry about with a proposed reduction, but the key takeaway is, one, respond to requests for a hearing. That's the first and most important thing. Respond in writing, and then get in touch with the VSO. So if you have not been working with a VSO to this point, Bill, is this the time to reach out and say, hey, I need some help?
Yes, it is. And, What I would also say, by the way, I haven't really gotten into this so far, but sometimes people will come to us after their rating has already been reduced, right? Because so far, everything that we've been talking about is VA's process for reducing the rating in the first place. But even once they reduce it, even after that, those become different, sort of in terms of the legal considerations involved. They are different types of arguments than you would be making, for example, if you were trying to argue for an initial increase. Because let's say that you are appealing, let's say VA reduced, I don't know, a lower back rating from 40% to 10%, right? At that point, the argument is not about whether the veteran has demonstrated like initial entitlement to their old rating. It's about whether VA followed due process in reducing it in the first place. It's a slightly different distinction, but what it does is like those standards that I mentioned earlier, like sustained improvement for things that have been in effect for 5 years or more, or even if there's a disability that hasn't been in effect for 5 years or more, did VA show adequate change? Did they do this based on an adequate exam? Those arguments don't disappear just because VA got away with reducing the rating. If you have that really inadequate exam and VA reduced your rating based on that, you can appeal that. And you can make the argument that VA essentially violated due process. I will say, though, that that is an area where I would really recommend bringing that to the Board of Veterans Appeals instead of doing it at the VA regional office, because I think the VA regional office, for better or worse, has a tendency to just sort of reflexively order new exams. I think that in my experience, if you make an argument about the propriety of a reduction to the VA, at the regional office level, they sort of treat that like it's a claim for increase, even though it really isn't. Again, it's not the veteran trying to prove that they are qualified for this higher rating the same way that it would sort of be on them to kind of demonstrate if you were claiming the initial increase. It's more incumbent upon you to show that you're entitled to it. Whereas if VA reduced it improperly, it's incumbent upon you more to show that they didn't follow the processes that they were supposed to follow. And again, it's a slightly different argument. But because the regional office has a tendency to just sort of respond to that by ordering medical exams, what you're basically doing is you're kind of muddling the water by dealing with that at the RO level, because they're just going to sort of keep adding these opinions to the file, and you're going to get further and further away procedurally from that reduction and whether that was right. Whereas the board doesn't have the ability to just sit there and reflexively order a C&P exam. They can issue a remand order telling the RO to do it, but they are actually going to have to sit there and weigh those facts and say, okay, well, did VA meet its burden of proof when they reduced this? Again, they don't have the easy out of just sending it out to another contractor. So again, that's sort of another thing, and maybe a little bit higher level than something that a layperson is going to be doing on their own. But just so you know, if VA reduced a rating without observing due process, the legal remedy for that is a complete restoration of the old rating. And that comes from a case called Kitchens v. Brown. And the court basically said that that kind of rating is what's called void ab initio. And so it's going to be set aside as not in accordance with the law.
So let's talk about timelines a little bit. You've mentioned the 30 days, the 60 days, really 30 to keep it going while you're going through the appeal, or not appeal, until you get to the hearing. How long does it take to have a hearing?
It really, really depends, honestly. Sometimes those hearings are scheduled relatively quickly, sometimes within a month or two. Sometimes I've seen them where they can take the better part of a year. I think it depends a lot on which regional office is scheduling them, to be honest with you, and whether that regional office has, a higher or a lower workload. Most of our hearings, for example, are done out of the Roanoke regional office, but we also get them out of like Little Rock, for example. So that's a very, very hard question for me to answer. At the end of the day, whenever someone asks me about timelines for VA, I kind of throw my hands up in the air, because at the end of the day, it's ultimately not up to me. But they definitely do try to do those certainly much faster than like a board hearing would be scheduled.
And that was my next question. So we're talking, months at least before the appeal hearing. Could be 30 days or could be a year. You've given us a range for the appeal hearing, but then, okay, I messed up. I didn't appeal. I didn't do anything, but they did it wrong. And I want to go to the board. What kind of timelines are those?
So I want to correct the terminology, first of all. So we don't call...
I need it. I'm not as precise.
No, it's okay. It's okay. So the proposed reduction hearings, we don't call those appeal hearings because, again,
Right.
it's not a final decision. It's a
Not an appeal.
predetermination action. You're still trying to convince VA that they should not do it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, let's say VA did reduce. Well, that has the same response time as any other final decision. It's 1 year.
Okay.
So after a final decision that denies a benefit, the veteran has 1 year to pick one of those three options: the supplemental claim, the higher level review, or the board appeal, to keep their effective date going. And so again, if we're talking about the appeal in this case, which, like I said before, I really think that the appeal is probably the right choice if you're dealing with a reduction of benefits that has already happened. Because, again, it's something that the board can't just respond to by adding additional information to the record that may or may not help you. The timeline for a Board of Veterans Appeals hearing to be scheduled right now is very, very long, to be honest with you. We are seeing these cases take sometimes 3 years to be scheduled for a hearing. But what I would also say is that not all appeals require a board hearing in front of a veterans law judge. And different appeals attorneys, I think, have different approaches to this. But if you're asking me, I think proposed reductions are one of the areas where you probably don't need a board hearing if the evidence is already there. Because if you think about it, it's different, right? The point of arguing a rating reduction is to explain that VA didn't do the right thing earlier. So sort of by nature, if you really have a good argument there, it's not contingent upon new evidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to point out the problems with what VA did with what they had. So in those cases, I would usually recommend probably like an evidence docket appeal, which is basically like maybe submitting some additional statements, perhaps like an explanation of, let's say you went to your C&P exam and they didn't use the goniometer, right? Maybe like a personal statement, or maybe you already did that. In that case, you might not even need to submit any new evidence at all, and you could just do what's called a direct docket appeal, which is just sort of packaging the file as is and sending it along. The direct docket is something that I usually don't recommend, just because I think that most cases do need new evidence. But there are a lot of reduction issues where, again, there was a clear problem with the C&P exam. The case I used earlier was, the veteran who walks with the cane, but then the examiner said that their gait is unaffected by their disability or something like that, where there's this really obvious contradiction that just kind of passed quality control somehow. You don't really need to submit new evidence for that. So
Mm-hmm.
the appeal hearing, I think, isn't always needed. And so I think that people get turned off from filing appeals sometimes because they think that it always requires a hearing. And it doesn't necessarily. I think that in many cases it is valuable. I really do believe that. It's, generally speaking, the most liberal with evidence submission, because you get, the whole time that you're waiting for it to be scheduled, and then 90 days afterwards to just build the evidence that you need to support a grant. But this is one of the reasons why, again, it's important to work with a VSO, because we'll help you figure out which of those options is actually right for you. I hope that helps.
So, Bill, we've talked about a lot of things related to proposed reductions. There's a number of things to keep in mind. I think we've touched on most of them. So, wiping the slate clean, what should a veteran know about a proposed reduction? Like, like going into it cold. Hey, what's the 30-second elevator speech? Maybe 60 seconds. Hey, what do I need to know about a proposed reduction? I'm a disabled veteran. I have some disabilities. The VA has come to me and said, we propose to reduce X, Y, and Z. What should I know? What should I do?
Right. So number one, there is only one way to respond to a proposed reduction. Again, it's to request a hearing and to submit evidence using some kind of a statement in support of claim. Again, usually it's going to be medical evidence that you want to file. If you have the ability to do it, go on va.gov, pull the disability benefits questionnaire that corresponds to the disability you're rated for, and see if your doctor is willing to fill it out. Because if they are, remember that most proposals happen because VA is looking at those forms. So using the DBQ is a way to speak to VA kind of in their language. The other thing I would say is, again, remember what you are doing when you file a claim for increase. You are going to trigger additional C&P examinations. And critically, this includes TDIU. If you file for TDIU, you will be re-examined for every disability you are service connected for. And if any of those exams suggests that your condition has improved in any way, shape, or form, the VA may conclude that your condition has improved and try and take those ratings away. Again, keep in mind that 5-year mark too, right? If you've had the same rating in effect for, let's say, 4 years, or even if it's less than that, right? And you can wait just wait, because that 5-year mark is so, so important, and it makes it so much harder for VA to take away your evaluations based on the findings of an examiner who, at the end of the day, is not your private doctor, is someone who's met with you for maybe 20 minutes. So just sort of keep that in mind. And if you must file before the 5-year mark, make sure you're supporting that in the right way, and include evidence that talks about the severity of your disability, work with the VSO, understand what the criteria is that VA is looking for, because it might not be the same things that are spelled out in your medical records.
Mm-hmm. Those are excellent points. I know we've talked about a lot of things. Is there anything else that I didn't talk about, that I didn't ask about, that's kind of somebody really kind of needs to know?
I think that we've covered a lot of really, really good ground, Tyler. Again, I actually train on this, and I've been going through, while you've been talking, the slides that I use to do it. And just remember, these reductions, they happen almost always because VA is sort of comparing an earlier government form to a later one. And sometimes it really is one check mark. One check mark that's different from one form to another is all it takes sometimes to trigger these reductions. So just be mindful how easy it is to fall under this trap, and work with an accredited VSO, especially if you're filing something that's not been in effect for 5 years or more. But I think it's always good to work with a VSO. I believe that, again, the VA does a lot for veterans, but the claims process has become increasingly bureaucratic ever since particularly the enactment of the Appeals Modernization Act in 2019. And it has gotten to the point, Tyler, where I cannot in good faith recommend that anyone go this alone anymore, because, again, this system is big, and it will steamroll people sometimes when there isn't someone there to stand up for them.
Yeah, there's a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of checking the blocks and performance metrics and all these things. And so it gets to be a challenge. One of the things I was kind of thinking about is, and I sort of alluded to earlier about, if you have an issue, you haven't been to the doctor, and you address that, there are times that the VA just sort of randomly says, hey, you've had this disability for 3 years. We'd like you to do another eval, another CMP, just through some checklist, or randomly, or maybe seemingly randomly.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
That's a great question, Tyler. And what you're talking about is something that VA calls a re-examination. Technically, VA has the latitude to order re-examinations anytime they think the veteran isn't being rated correctly. But in practice, re-examinations are most common for disabilities that at the time they are rated, VA knows that they might be likely to improve. The cancer example that I gave earlier is a really good example. VA knows that when somebody has cancer, if it goes into remission, it's going to be reevaluated. So cancer is usually given a routine future examination. And of course, they'll just continue to do it. They'll check on it. If it's still active, they just continue the rating at 100% and then decide to check on it again later on down the line. Another area where VA is kind of prone to doing that is mental health, because mental health can change, over time, depending on the outcome of treatment and things like that. Usually, though, VA will sort of put that in writing somewhere that they plan to do some kind of what they call a routine future exam. Otherwise, outside of that, for the most part, it's filing the claim for increase, it's inviting them to review it in some way. That's usually what triggers those examinations. But again, there are situations also where VA will do it of their own accord. It's just that I would say that's a little less common than, again, the veteran who accidentally sets themselves up for the reduction by filing the claim for increase.
And filing the claim for increase is much more common as a trigger than it is just sort of a random reevaluation.
That's certainly what I see on the hearing side. Most of those cases that I see at the reduction stage, they happen because the veteran filed a claim for increase that maybe didn't have the best evidentiary support, and they got a CNP exam that maybe wasn't the best. VA just sort of, again, interprets the report. The examiner probably didn't say that the veteran actually got better, but VA interprets it that way. And kind of going to the same vein, by the way, if you have a CNP exam and walking out of that you did not have a good experience with that examiner, document that. Call VA, let them know, tell your VSO, let them know I had this exam. And then that way, if there is a reduction that's proposed based on that, your complaint is kind of documented there, right? Like, VA might get that report
near in time to the event. It wasn't when you started were proposed for reduction. It was, hey, that exam was off. Something was wrong. He saw me for 2 minutes and said, I got your forms and I'll take care of it.
Right. And then you're sort of laying the groundwork in case you need to challenge that later on, because you're right. If you do it after the fact, sometimes it can be sort of seen as a little bit self-serving, where of course you're questioning the exam because they said that, you got better, even though they didn't. But, you're right. Doing it preemptively when you had a really bad experience with someone is important, because I've certainly seen situations where, like for range of motion testing, the examiner will basically manhandle a veteran, and kind of like twist them around and see what they can and can't do. Sometimes people are actually, put into pain by some of the things that those folks do. I'm not disparaging anyone. I'm just telling you, like, this is what I've seen.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, the VA is not out to get veterans. They're trying to help, but they're also trying to be good stewards of the people's money, and they're trying to do the right thing and follow the rules. I believe that. But they're also going, hey, you've gotten better. You had cancer and you absolutely deserved 100%. You don't have cancer anymore. The rule is, you get the residuals, hey, it might be 10 or 20, 30%, whatever it is, but it's not 100%. And that's fair and legitimate. And if you have PTSD, a lot of people do get better from PTSD. They have improvement. So it's totally reasonable to expect at some period of time in the future, you might be a lot better. You may not be 100% better, but you're a lot better than you were. And especially if somebody's in crisis for a period of time or something. Yeah, that's totally reasonable. So it's not adversarial necessarily for them to ask, but it is a adversarial process to prove that you have gotten better. So that's why you have to go and request that hearing.
Yeah. And that's a really good point, because, just sort of working in the field that I do, I see the cases that didn't go well, right? If someone, knows that the reduction is proper and they just don't fight it and it's valid, that doesn't even come to my desk. The cases that I see are very often the horror stories. Again, like the doctor who, they clearly filled the report out the wrong way. The veteran had a terrible experience with their examiner, things like that. But they're not all like that. And at the end of the day, all disability ratings, they are based on current severity. So when there is an improvement, VA is going to properly take that away. It's just that you want to make sure that they are respecting your due process right while they do that. And again, I've definitely seen situations where just sort of, because it's kind of like a game of telephone almost, right? Like the VA rater is not actually talking to the examiner when they do this. They're just reading the report that was provided. They are not medical professionals. It's not always going to be the case that they understand immediately what's wrong with something that an examiner said. So it's just kind of bringing that kind of thing to their attention, just making sure that someone is rated correctly.
We've been talking with Bill Libby. He's an appeals attorney at the Department of Veterans Services here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Bill, thank you so much for spending time with us and explaining all the different ways these things happen, what to do, and don't freak out. Go get a VSO. If the VA comes to you and says, hey, we'd like to propose to reduce your disability rating, there's a lot of things you can do to do it the right way and make sure that they follow the rules the way they expect you to follow the rules.
Thanks, Tyler. Been my pleasure.
Thanks for joining us this week on Coming Home Well with Dr. Tyler Piron. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and a review. Thanks again. And until all are home and all are well, this is Coming Home Well.